All right, I want to deal with units 12 and 13 together because they make up what is called a Hausstaffel or house rules that were fairly common in that era. Paul and others do this in the New Testament, and they also had this in common with some of the Greek moralists. And it's not really surprising that they would, because certainly the life of one who is a follower of Christ ought to have a greater morality than even the moralists of that day. And so you expected people in the church who are followers of Christ to live out these relationships in the household in a graceful and loving way. And that really is what Paul is talking about here. So, uh, uh, because all of life is important in the context of living out Christ in our lives. Uh, you know, I see a lot of folks struggle with this, and it's really a tough thing. I know a lot of preachers who find it easier to relate sometimes to the people in the church and the people in the community than they do their own families. And I think Paul said something about this when he talked about taking care of those in your own household. So it's really an important thing. So we need to pay close attention to what Paul says here, and I think that it is a couple of really important units, key units in this letter. I want you to notice that the motivation for all of our relationships and how we get along in those relationships is the motivation of Christ being lived out in our lives. We want to follow Him, be imitators of Him, walk in the way that Paul has been talking about in these chapters as he's led up to this. Marcus Bart, in his anchor commentary on Ephesians, actually has 2 volumes of that. But he said that every ought is supported by a Christological is. I think that's a fancy way of saying that it is the life of Christ and the example of Christ and the presence of Christ in our lives that really makes a difference in that. So look at these house rules, if you will. You have the husbands and wives. I would back up to verse 21 to begin with that mutual submission, because Paul certainly makes that, I think, an important part of this. And then he talks about the role of the husband and the role of the wife. Then he moves to the parents and children, and then to the slaves and masters. And those latter two are in 6, 1 through 9. Now, what I want you to notice about it is there are some general principles that we should always remember. These are in my notes, but I just want to point them out to you here. First of all, the purpose of these rules is not to serve as a legalistic guideline, but to make faith in Christ relevant to private and public daily conduct, living day by day, living out Christ in our lives. That's what's important here. Secondly, the motivation for all of the injunctions in this Hausstaffel is Christ. As Bart said, for every ought, there's a Christological is. Because of who Christ is in our lives, this is how we ought to act. And then third, every relationship of life should be transformed into an instrument of redemption in the world. What we need to remember is that we are called to proclaim the good news from here to the very ends of the earth. That doesn't skip over our families. And so we need to make sure that we're living out Christ and being disciple makers in our own families as we seek to live for Him. And then fourth, the concept of submission is by its very definition a voluntary act with a redemptive purpose. So it is something that we enter into by decision, whether we're talking about husbands, wives, parents, children, slaves, masters, we enter into this relationship by decision, and we seek to live it out for a redemptive purpose. I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind. Now, one of my former teachers used to say, and it's really stuck with me throughout the years, the other person in the relationship ought to be a better person as a result of the relationship, as a result of knowing me. The spouse should be a better person. The child should be a better person. The employee, employer, whatever the situation, whatever the relation is that we're talking about. So we need to remember this. One other thing that I think is extremely important, and I hope you'll note as you wrestle through both of these units, the unit 12 is relating to husbands and wives, unit 13 to the parents' children, and then to the slaves and masters. Don't forget, don't overlook the fact that Paul always puts the burden on the strong. He puts the burden on the person who's in the better position. So if you'll notice that with husbands, wives, if you'll notice that with parents, children, if you'll notice that with slaves and masters, I think it will help you to understand and interpret these two units. So go for it, and let's see what you come up with, both in the individual interpretation and in the group collaboration.